Okay, everyone, so now we're going to talk about Chapter 19. In Chapter 18, we did a brief overview. What is qualitative research and what are some of the different approaches, like naturalism or grounded theory? But for this chapter, we're going to look at what are the actual research methods. So once we've decided what approach to do, whether that's studying people in their natural habitat or trying to create a theory from the ground up, how do qualitative researchers actually engage with their clients? It's not a bunch of measurement tools and questionnaires. They have a different approach. So let's talk about it. So although qualitative research might be more, quote, flexible than quantitative research, right? You have the ability to change and shift as you're going versus quantitative research where you typically have everything created ahead of time. You have your research done, your research question, your hypothesis, all of your methods, all of your procedures, and then you go for it. Qualitative is a little bit more flexible, but I think one of the biases that people have had about qualitative is that it's not structured, and that's really untrue. Good qualitative research is very well structured, so even though it's flexible, there still is a process for it. And so Rubin and Babbie talk about some of the steps that you can do to prepare for a qualitative study. You're going to select your approach based on the ones we talked about in the last chapter. You're going to complete some sort of literature review. You're not going to go in totally blind. You may not have a super formed research question, but you at least have a topic that you want to learn more about. And so a lot of qualitative researchers are still going to do some sort of literature review to see what are the existing studies about this, what are the gaps. Sometimes we have a lot of quantitative research, and simply the gap is there's just no qualitative about a topic. And so we can do a really nice job of saying, hey, there were 20 studies looking at this facet of an issue, but there weren't a whole lot that actually interviewed clients about their perspective of it. So you do that literature review to see what's out there, see what's missing, see what's existing. Then you're going to identify and engage those key informants. And so a lot of times when we're doing qualitative research, it's very personal, it's very intimate. We may be doing detailed interviews with people. And so because of that, we don't want to walk in and say, here's my study, here's what I'm doing, support me in it, right? A lot of times we need those key informants because they're going to be aware of what the mood and the environment is like, what the barriers you might face would be. And so they might have a better idea. Now, obviously key informants might bring their own bias, but it's important to really engage with key informants to help us design the study and to help us kind of get the foot in the door, so to speak, and make sure that the study we're doing is honoring the environment and the people that we want to study. So key informants play a really critical role. We also want to establish contact then and build rapport. So let's say your key informants have said, hey, this is the topic you're studying. It's a great idea. Here's some ideas. And you go in. Now, with contact, it's really important. Rubin and Babbie talk about the importance to think about order. So for example, if you're at a large organization, who you meet with first could potentially influence your bias and perceptions. So if you meet with the leadership first, they might say one thing that could potentially bias you. You're like, oh man, the leadership's so smart. They've got it together. Their mission's amazing. And then when you go in and people are super unhappy, if you're not aware, you could start thinking, man, they just seem kind of whiny. I talked to leadership and they were great. Or vice versa. You might talk to the participants, maybe the workers in the agency, and they're so unhappy about things. And then you go to leadership and they have no idea. And you become almost like, oh, I can't believe they don't have any idea of what's going on here. So we have to be aware of our bias and the order in which we meet people. And we have to make sure that we're treating people respectfully, openly, and building that rapport with everyone that we interview or engage with in this process. And then finally, we have to be clear about our study purpose. So obviously, the book talks about you have a choice about how much you have to disclose or want to disclose. And there's some ethical issues around things like deception or kind of minimizing the purpose of research. What I found in general is with social work qualitative research, we really should be open about why we're there and what we're studying. We're building such a connection with people. We're asking such intimate, deep questions sometimes. I feel like deception would be really, really rarely justified in the type of studies that we do and the type of studies that I've read. Obviously, there's going to be exceptions, but I feel like deception isn't really ideal in a lot of social work qualitative research. So we have a couple of things to consider. First, we want to consider what do we want our role to be? So the book talks about there's kind of this spectrum of roles. On one end, you can be a complete participant. This is your participant only. You don't tell anyone you're doing a research study. You are just the participant. If they are planning a protest for an organization, you just go with them to the protest and you act like you're a protester. Now, the book brings up a whole lot of ethical questions about deception. And one of the challenges is you may engage or interact in a way that affects the situation you're studying. So maybe you're acting as a participant and you know some research about the topic people are about to protest, and you start sharing some of that, not even thinking about it, and that changes how they approach the protest. So there is that risk. Then we have participant as an observer. So in this case, you're a full participant, but you do let people know that you're also doing a study. So one of the challenges that you have is if you risk moving closer to the participant's way of things, or what they sometimes used to refer to as going native. And so participant as observer, if you're very clear about it, you make sure you're not coercing anyone, you're making sure that you kind of do your normal thing so it doesn't impact the study, can absolutely be a role that we play. Now, as you start to shift to the other side, you might have observer as participant. This is where you're very clear. I'm a researcher first, but you're still engaged with the issue. So maybe you are a researcher and you want to look at a college classroom. It's not your own college classroom, and you're very clear, hey, I'm a researcher, I'm going to analyze students on Psychology 101, but you go to the class, you meet with the students, you hear the professor. So you might still have that engagement, but it's very clear you're an observer first or a researcher first. And then finally, we have a complete observer, which is where you have real no engagement. The participants may not even be aware that you're watching or studying them. It can be a very unobtrusive observation. And so you really have to figure out, where do you want your role to be when you are going to be a qualitative researcher? Also, you have to discuss what relationship will you have with your participants. So the book talks about two different approaches. One is the EDIC approach, which is really focused more on objectivity and understanding the participant's point of view. And you might even adopt it temporarily, especially if you're like a participant as observer or complete participant, but you're still trying to maintain some of that objectivity, right? Thinking more about that idea of contemporary positivism. Or you can use an EMIC approach or EMIC approach, which is making an effort to really adopt the beliefs, attitudes, and other points of view shared by the culture being studied. So this is one where we're really going deep in, we adopt those views, we take them on ourselves when we're studying the population. And so I saw an interesting article, not in Rubin and Babbie, but they said the EDIC really brings more of that outsider role, and an EMIC approach is more of an insider perspective. Now, I think that's a little cut and dry. I think you can go both ways, but there's definitely a slightly different approach. So you have to figure out, what is your approach that you want to have with the participants? And then finally, how do you handle reflexivity? So reflexivity refers to this idea that we have to be deeply aware of our own bias and how it could affect our research. So thinking about the fact that a lot of qualitative research can be very subjective. And so because of that subjectivity, we have to be so acutely aware of the bias and our own approaches and our own values, and make sure those aren't influencing either our research, we're not influencing how we identify themes or what our perspective is, and we have to make sure that we're aware of how research influences us and our perspective as well. So there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. One common way is making notes as you're identifying patterns or coding, to really make sure that you're noting, what was I thinking in this moment? What values came up for me? How did this affect my own personal views of this topic? You might keep a journal or jot down observations as you are coding or interviewing. And so reflexivity is really important, that we're just aware, and it's always at the forefront of our mind. So one of the most common ways to collect data in qualitative research is through the qualitative interview. Now, there's a couple different ways that we can do it. It often, regardless of the type, tends to be more open-ended and less structured than survey research. Survey research, as we mentioned, you send stuff out, the survey's there, it's ready to go, all the questions are there. Qualitative interviewing has a little bit more freedom and flexibility, and it can be very flexible and iterative. So you can change it and refine it as you go. So if you're interviewing someone and they start to go off topic a little bit, you can follow that, versus a lot of survey research may not have that flexibility. Also, it may lack a specific set of questions. So you can have a more structured qualitative interview. We'll talk about the different types. Or you can be on the other side and have no specific questions, just more concepts or issues or ideas that you want to talk. And as you're asking probing questions and they're sharing with you, you're taking notes, you're getting more information. In fact, Rubin and Babbie say that if you're talking more than 5% of the interview, you might be talking too much. That we really should be asking those simple questions to get and elicit more and more information from our clients, which really parallels what we do as social workers as well. We shouldn't be talking half the time with our clients. A lot of times we should be using good questions to really hear what they have to say and give them that chance and choice to speak. So the book talks about 3 different different types of qualitative interviewing. The first is just the informal conversational interview. This is the least structured of the three types. It's unplanned. You might come into a situation, an event, a town hall, and you just start asking questions of people. When you're in the field, you may have an idea of where you're going, right? It's not a totally just loose conversation. You may say, hey, I'm here because I'm really interested in hearing people's perspective about this topic, but you don't have your notebook, you don't have your questions necessarily. You just come in and you really adopt a not knowing stance, which is the term that I use. Rubin and Babbie use a similar one. But not knowing stances, we use this a lot in other parts of social work, child welfare or working as a therapist, that we don't go in and say, here's what I think is going on right off the bat. We really come in and say, hey, I may have my theories, but I want to hear what the person I'm interviewing is saying. What is their perspective of the issue? I don't need to come in and act like I'm the expert. I haven't heard their side of the story. And so informal conversational interviews really follow that flow. The middle, so we've got really unstructured with the informal conversational interview. The second kind of mid-level is an interview guide approach. So this is a lot more planned and structured. You have consistent questions because one of the advantages is if you ask 10 participants a similar set of questions, you can start to compare them. You could say, wow, I asked about this topic and 7 out of 10 people responded with these types of themes. So there's some value in having a little bit more structure. But typically with these interview guides, they might have more flexibility in the order and the wording. So they might give you a topic or they might give you a question, but you have the freedom to adjust it a little if someone doesn't understand it. Or if they start talking about something earlier than the guide shows, you can go to that and start asking questions related to that. So a little bit more structure, but still pretty flexible. And then finally, we have standardized open-ended interviews. These are the most structured. They typically have predetermined order and wording. Your people, your clients or participants can talk and give you a lot of information, but you still have a very structured order that you are doing it in. A couple of other qualitative approaches that we can do is we can ask a life history, sometimes referred to as a life story or oral history interviews. So this is really like a combination of naturalism where we're asking people to just share their story without necessarily having a lot of explanation in it, but it's also like a case study because we're focusing on one group or one organization or one individual. And so that can really provide a lot of information as well. You can also use focus groups. They're typically smaller groups of people. Rubin and Babbie recommend around 8 people, which I've seen echoed in other research. And with focus groups, they can vary from super structured to super unstructured. So you could just bring a bunch of people in a room and say, hey, I want to talk about the latest city council proposal. What do you all think about it? And they can talk, or it could be very structured and say, hey, I have a series of questions I'm going to ask. As you respond, I'm going to take notes and record what you say. Sometimes one group isn't representative of everyone. And so you can do groups multiple times. Maybe you meet with 8 people here and 10 people here and 7 people here. If you ask the same questions, you can start to see patterns and themes. So there's a couple of benefits to focus groups. They're inexpensive, they're fast, and they really can encourage conversation, especially on topics where people might feel like they're the only person viewing something this way. Hearing other people say, oh yeah, I totally agree with that, can be very liberating. But there are some limitations. There's limits of representativeness because we don't know if the people that come to the focus group, maybe we didn't randomly sample them. Maybe we just put out a flyer and said, come talk to us. We want to hear your opinion. Well, that may not be super representative of the population. And Google and Yelp review, right? We may often get people with extreme views on either side showing up, which may not necessarily be representative either. There's also evidence that if you don't feel strongly about something, but someone takes a hard side on the opposite end, sometimes we feel like we have to defend it and then we get more passionate about it. And so with groups, if you have 2 extreme views, you can have someone in the middle, but if they feel like they have to defend against the other side, then they start feeling stronger and stronger. So it may not be representative. There's also a lot of pressure to conform, which it can really have an effect on focus groups. And it can be really challenging to transcribe and analyze, right? Lots of people talking, they might be talking over each other, and that can create some challenges as well. Finally, when we're looking at how we record data, there's different ways. Ideally, we would do direct recordings and then transcribe them. That's great because then you realize you catch every word, or at least as much as your recording allows you to. There's a lot of really great software too that you can literally pop in the transcript and it will transcribe it for you, which is really nice. It makes it a little bit easier. If you're not able to record it, let's say you are working with a group of people who are undocumented and they do not want you to record anything they're saying, you could do things like take notes and write as close to verbatim as you can. When I used to do political surveys as a telephone surveyor, we had a lot of open-ended questions. And so we would just type as they were talking and I would take notes as close to verbatim as I could. Or another option that they recommend is similar to what we do in social work, is you jot down quick notes in the moment and then you write out your detailed notes soon after the interview is over. I thought about it more like an assessment. With an assessment, I'm typically taking some quick notes. I'm not going to write verbatim everything my client says because then I'd be focused more on my notes and my client. I do quick notes, and then after they leave, that's when I sit down and I write it all out into a cohesive assessment. Research can be the same way. You take quick notes in the moment, you end the interview, and then you go type up as much as you can remember. So different ways to record qualitative data. Then we'll go into the data analysis in the next chapter. Here are my references. Thanks so much.